In the previous two videos on chapter 13, you saw that John makes 42 allusions to the temple menorah and the Feast of Dedication in his repetitious mentioning of a number of series of sevens. And he begins his book with an open allusion to Christ walking in the midst of the temple menorah in chapter 1. You saw that Counter-Reformationist preachers and theologians just ignore these allusions to the temple menorah and pretend they are not even there. You also saw that over 60% of the entire text in chapter 13 is written by John to explicitly prophesy the rise of a form of government known as an absolute monarchy, which Counter-Reformationists preachers and theologians also intentionally just completely ignore, as though it is not even there. Despite the fact references to it are found in over 60% of the texts in the chapter. And you saw that John specifically mentions military equipment, which historically date his prophecies as targeting a time in history before the 1500s. And that same absolute monarchy engages in the use of religious iconography. And when you query all the absolute monarchies left in the world, there are only 5 places where John's prophecies could even occur. And when you filter them by both time frame and description, including the use of religious icons, it leaves only one place on the earth and in history these prophecies could be speaking about. And this is all before we have even begun to dig into the specific details of this chapter. You also saw in the second video that while some texts have been translated perfectly accurately and clean, there are other major sections of text that seem to have been intentionally obfuscated by translators, selecting secondary and tertiary definitions of Greek words that fit the context much less better than the primary definitions of the words they skipped over from the Textus Receptus. And now that we have reconstructed the text and obtained a clean translation directly from the Greek text, we are now going to go through our reconstructed text and see what it is that it is telling us, and why the translators and Counter-Reformationist propagandists have worked so hard to hide what is actually in this chapter. You will soon see why obfuscation was the only option left for Counter-Reformationists, and why, given their ethical embrace of public deceit, that is what they chose to so profusely do. But in the end, it made them nothing more than servants of the actual Antichrist John had prophesied against as early as 95 AD. And the tragedy of the Counter-Reformationist minister and theologian is that after a lifetime of religious activism, they will stand before the God of Christ and the apostles of the New Testament they claim to follow, condemned as a spiritual traitor and follower of the very beast John had warned the world against in the book of Revelation. They intentionally hid from public view. In chapter 13, like many of the previous chapters in Revelation, we have once again 2 prophecies. The first prophecy describes the rise of what the textual titles in the KJV will call the first beast. This prophecy goes from verse 1 to verse 10. The second prophecy is usually entitled the second beast, and runs from verse 11 to the end of the chapter in verse 18, with a prophecy concerning 666. Like in the previous chapters, these 2 prophecies are related to each other, but are 2 different prophecies on their own, describing 2 different timelines and sets of events. They are extensive and graphic, and detailed in nature. There are specific references, which also make them unmistakable in history. And once again, because these 2 prophecies are so detailed, we will have to look at each one separately because the bulk of prophetic material is so extensive. Logistically, they simply cannot be covered in a single video together, without running several hours long. There is literally that much material that has to be covered. When we are finished, you will see how horrifically bad the Counter-Reformation's bogus eschatology has literally raped and mutilated this chapter in order to hide themselves. You will never be impressed with their cover stories again, whether it be their fraudulent claims about Nero, or yet future Antichrist, that comes at the end of the world, during a fictitious 7-year tribulation period. The beauty and magnitude of John's prophecies in Revelation chapter 13 are awe-inspiring, and as detailed and specific as could be written. They are filled with such historical detail, they cannot be mistaken for anything else on planet Earth, nor in the history of humanity. You simply have to want to lie about them. Which is precisely what the Counter-Reformation actually does. Before we go over our textual analysis of the first prophecy in Revelation 13, we must first, unfortunately, spend some time clearing away Counter-Reformation propaganda and disinformation first. Like what they do in the rest of Revelation, they bury this text and its historical fulfillment through a pile of unethical prevarication, distortion, and obfuscation. That is not simply a biased criticism of what they do. That is objectively and factually what they actually, really do. In the Wikipedia article entitled The Historicist Interpretation of Daniel, the article states, quote, "One of the aspects of the Protestant historicist paradigm is the speculation that the little horn power, which rose after the breakup of the Roman Empire, is the papacy, the predicted Antichrist power. Futurism and preterism, alternate methods of prophetic interpretation, were used by Jesuits to oppose this interpretation that the Antichrist was the papacy." End quote. Footnote number 2 states, quote, "Jesuit scholarship rallied to the Roman cause by providing two plausible alternatives to the historical interpretation of the Protestants. 1. Luis de Alcazar (1554–1630) of Seville, Spain, devised what became known as the preterist system of prophetic interpretation. This theory proposed that the Revelation deals with events in the pagan Roman Empire, that Antichrist refers to Nero, and that the prophecies were therefore fulfilled long before the time of the medieval church. Alcazar's preterist system has never made any impact on the conservative or evangelical wing of the Protestant movement, although in the last 100 years it has become popular among Protestant rationalists and liberals. 2. A far more successful attack was taken by Francisco Ribera (1537–1591) of Salamanca, Spain. He was the founder of the futurist system of prophetic interpretation. Instead of placing Antichrist way in the past as did Alcazar, Ribera argues that Antichrist would appear way in the future. About 1590, Ribera published a 500-page commentary on the Apocalypse, denying the Protestant application of Antichrist to the Church of Rome. M. L. Moser, Jr., Unapologetic of Premillennialism, pages 27. End quote. Recently, in America, people across the world were shocked to see a Minnesota policeman murder a man by putting his knee to his neck, cutting off oxygen to the brain, and resulting in his death. This brutal technique for killing has been known for thousands of years. In the Catholic Church, when the Reformation occurred, the Jesuits were given the task of heading up the Counter-Reformation. When you look on the outside of their headquarters in Rome, you will see the statue of Ignatius Loyola with his foot on the neck of a Protestant Christian, killing him. It is still there to this day. And it's not the only Jesuit statue of its kind, displaying this violent militancy. There are many like this. When you look the word Jesuit up in the dictionary, you will discover as its secondary definition that it is used colloquially as a derogatory term for someone that uses equivocation. Or it is used as a synonym for equivocation. Well, what is equivocation? If you look up the word equivocation, you will discover it means to hide or conceal the truth. Or in other words, it is simply a nice word for lying. It is the kind of lying that is colloquially known as lawyer lying. Technically true, but misleading. Such as is often heard in the phrase used by political defendants, "I do not recall." Even when the event was only days ago, or involved historical events that no one could possibly forget. It is an amazing thing that when you look up the name of the most prominent and powerful group of Counter-Reformationists, the definition of it in the dictionary is liar. But that is precisely what the nature of the Counter-Reformation really is. It is to be a liar, religiously. It is to make a religion out of lying. And actually think you are doing God a service through your lying. It sounds twisted, because it is. And that is what happens when you break your spiritual compass, and north becomes south, and south becomes north. Satan becomes God to you, and God becomes Satan to you. And you never know which is which. That is literally what the term lost soul actually means. Counter-Reformationists are lost souls in the literal sense of that term. And unfortunately, all the people who follow them or subscribe to their teachings are lost souls as well. We have addressed their false claims in each of the chapters we have covered. And we will address their false claims in this chapter as well. And as you will see, this will be the first of many such false claims they will make about this chapter. But if you do not realize that these sources are very dedicated to the intentional practice of deceit and obfuscation, you will never truly understand how despicable and underhanded some of these false claims really are. Especially when they are making up these claims, all along actually knowing they are really truly false. But they simply use them because they find that these claims effectively deceive people, which they actually, intentionally, want to do. Most people fail to appreciate the gravity of the fact that there are entire international and global religious institutions and orders that exist today to intentionally spread disinformation and intentional deception to people when it comes to the Book of Revelation. Entire global orders, with millions upon millions of dollars to spend, to do nothing more than make sure you end up deceived when it comes to the Book of Revelation. Once you actually realize this truth is real, you will probably spend a few minutes in shock, processing it. But you will also see why there is a constant proliferation of absolute stupidity on the internet, in Christian media, on television, and in the theater, all pushing zombies, the end times, the apocalypse, the rapture, and the end of the world. It is all there by design, to make sure and keep you completely deceived. They actually work at this, and for the most part, they have been very successful. And most people do not even realize it's even being done to them. One of their claims concerning chapter 13 is that it can possibly refer to the papacy because of the prophecy concerning the 10 kingdoms. They call it the 10 kingdom theory, which they purport or claim to show never happened. But the way they reach that conclusion is completely misleading. It is really just another Counter-Reformation act, using smoke and mirrors. But if we do not cover it, you will see it, and mistakenly think there may be some truth to it. You will note at the top of their pages, or blogs, the title, which they will often use, the 10 Kingdom Theory. When you see that title, you need to know, you have just read their first lie. It is not a theory that there were 10 kingdoms. There either were 10 kingdoms, or there were not. If there were, it's not a theory. If there wasn't, then claiming there were, is a lie. Historical fact is not a theory. We don't talk about historical fact in terms of a theory. It is not a theory that Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. It is not a theory that the United States was founded. It is not a theory that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, or that southern United States had slaves, or that Russia was communist, or that the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. These are not theories. These are facts. When you look up the definition of the word theory in the dictionary, you will discover it has a very broad range of meanings. From the very scientific meaning, which means something that is true, and has passed a rigorous standard of tests and peer review examinations, to that, which means simply conjecture or speculation, having little or no basis, in fact. When the Counter-Reformationist uses the term theory in their title, the 10 Kingdom Theory, they mean the word theory in the derogatory sense only. And in that usage, they are introducing you to their first intentional lie. Individuals that choose to use that terminology have made themselves out to be liars. In the same way, if they had said the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, theory, or the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, theory, or the atomic bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, theory. So when you see that title, you need to immediately realize you are about to read the words of a Counter-Reformationist liar. And if you don't believe they are liars, look up the definition of the word Jesuit in Webster's dictionary. Wikipedia.com lists 4 differences between fact versus opinion. When you go down the list, you will notice that the main difference between a fact and an opinion is that facts are anchored to tangible evidence. They can be proven and verified. Opinions are ideas that cannot. That is the difference. The fact that 10 kingdoms did come out of the fall of the Roman Empire is simply an historical fact. It is not an opinion. It is not a speculation, nor a conjecture, nor a theory. And that is precisely what the book of Daniel prophesied. All the arguments you will ever read under this misleading title, the 10 Kingdom Theory, all come down to 5 rather flimsy excuses. In order to conceal the fact, these are flimsy excuses, they will bold title each point, and then bloat the point with a bunch of meandering citations. Counter-Reformationists try to disconnect this text from the rise of the papacy, claiming that the 10 kingdoms are still future only. They do this by making the following 5 arguments. First, they claim historicist lists of the 10 kingdoms are all different. Therefore it never happened. Secondly, they claim there ended up being more than 10. Therefore it never happened. Thirdly, they claim that since the 10 kingdoms didn't involve the nation of Israel and Palestine, the 10 kingdoms that never happened in the wrong place. Fourthly, they claim that the list of 10 kingdoms that never happened focuses on the western half of the empire only. Therefore it never happened. Fifthly, they claim that the kingdoms are said to endure until the return of Christ. Since the 10 kingdoms that never happened didn't endure into our present day, and Christ's return is still future, therefore it never happened. On Catholic apologists and counter-reformationist rapture theology websites, you will see these 5 points repeated in various sequences, with a lot of bloat material, but it always goes back to these same basic 5 talking points. These 5 complaints represent their very best arguments, that is why they always appear. These are the very best arguments they have. If these arguments do not work, or are not really valid, then what that means is that this text definitely does refer to the papacy, without doubt. Because these are the very best arguments they have against it. The very best they have. So let's take a look at these 5 arguments, and see how good they really are. First, is it true that historicist lists of the 10 kingdoms are always different, therefore, this variation proves it never happened? That is really an amazingly hypocritical claim by counter-reformationists. The claim is that if there is some variation in reference to a topic, then it proves the claim is untrue. And this is coming from a group of teachers who come up with a new date for the rapture every 2 years. But somehow can't seem to apply the same standard to themselves they wish to apply to everyone else. So, before we even begin dissecting that claim, we have to note that criticism is the height of hypocrisy for counter-reformationists. It obviously would also prove the rapture is not true. So rapture counter-reformationists who employ that argument should really be ashamed of themselves. Secondly, in every field of knowledge, it is natural to have debate and different proposals. Not once in the history of any field have such debates been considered proof the knowledge was therefore non-existent. There are many different schools of thought on quantum physics. No one claims it therefore does not exist. Which is extremely different than the numerous and extremely varied predictions of dates for the rapture that never ever happen. Thirdly, it is actually a false accusation. While there is some minor variation on the names for the 10 kingdoms, in many cases, the lists are still referring to the same general areas of Europe. The reason the names differ is because of how the histories which are written differ in their descriptions, with a few variations. Because people are generally unfamiliar with many details of European history, this can be very confusing. So, let's take it out of the realm of the unfamiliar, and put the same process we are talking about into more familiar terms, to illustrate what is sometimes happening. On your screen, you see 4 lists, each listing the 3 countries involved in the American Revolution. Every American gets taught this history, and is very familiar with it. And every American knows from their history classes what these 3 countries are. But as you see on your screen, there are 4 lists, which are completely different. The Counter-Reformation would have you believe that since these 4 lists are different, the American Revolution never happened. Do you believe that is a valid claim? Do variation of names on 4 lists concerning which 3 countries were involved prove the American Revolution never happened? No, it does not. Because despite the fact these 4 lists are all different, they are also all correct. And even if they weren't, it would have no impact on whether or not the American Revolution ever occurred. The claim is a completely ridiculous one, to begin with. And the claim they are all different is basically false, anyway. There are some famous historicist teachers that have variations on their lists, but it is also true that that same list of 10 kingdoms has actually been amazingly consistent for 5 centuries. Much more consistent than their dates for the rapture. The reason it has remained so consistent over the centuries is because the source of the historical references to it has also remained the same. The most comprehensive and detailed history of the Roman Empire, after the Reformation, was written by an historical scholar, by the name of Edward Gibbons, entitled, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It became the gold standard for historical research for centuries. His work was so monumental, it was included in the Greatest Books of the Western World series, by Encyclopedia Britannica. In Gibbons' history, he details the history of 7 of the 10 kingdoms, in his writings. The 7 that were not destroyed. The other 3 were destroyed by Rome, so there was no detailed history of them, other than the descriptions of their destruction. And very few vary on what the names of those 3 that were destroyed actually were. They too are a matter of public historical record. Since almost all historicists consulted Gibbons' work, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, they virtually all shared the same list of 10 kingdoms. Here is an article in Baptist magazine from 1848, citing the list of kingdoms from Gibbons. Here is a modern website in 2021, 178 years later, citing the same nations, from Gibbons, in 2021. Here is a map of those 10 kingdoms in 2021. Here is another map of those same 10 kingdoms. Here is another map of those same 10 kingdoms. Here is another map of those same 10 kingdoms. So where is all this variation? It is literally the very same list of kingdoms, given by Gibbons, 2.5 centuries ago, in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It is the same list cited in 1848, that is cited today in 2021. The very same list you saw on all these maps. So the claim that there is all this unusual or unreliable variation in the lists, is simply patently false. It is a counter-reformation lie. Next we come to the claim, that since there ended up being more than 10 kingdoms, it never happened. Is that valid? Once again, let's apply that logic to something more familiar. If you read a prophecy about the United States, and the prophecy said that out of these 13 colonies, there would be the founding of a place called Washington, D.C. And after that, the colonies would become states and proliferate, and become so many, that 13 would become 25. A counter-reformationist would want you to believe that that prophecy is completely false and never happened, because obviously, there are 50 states. But the problem with the counter-reformationist's claim, is that there really was 25 states. As every American knows, the states were added one by one. So it really did go from 13 to 25. It just didn't stop at 25, but at no point did the prophecy claim that is all there would be. It simply said there would be 25. And there was. The same thing occurred with Daniel's prophecy. There were 10. Yes, more came, but they also disappeared. And the number of the 10 kingdoms, after the destruction of 3, is 7. If you Google how many kingdoms there are in Europe today, you will discover there are precisely 7 kingdoms, even still today. So far from proving the prophecy did not occur, this point actually proves it did. The third point of their excuse-making, is that, since the 10 kingdoms didn't involve Palestine, Israel, it didn't count. And therefore it never happened. Well, that is another completely stupid complaint, because as you saw in the previous videos, there are 2 prophecies in the book of Revelation. The first prophecy is about Israel's destruction and restoration, but the second prophecy is about the rise, fall and eventual destruction of Rome. We are now in the second prophecy, and the focus of John's prophecy now is no longer just about events affecting Israel. He is prophesying the rise of a new Roman monarchy, so naturally the 10 kingdoms would be about the western half of the empire, because that is where the new monarchy is going to rise. And once again, their own criticism actually serves as proof. John's prophecy is referencing the absolute monarchy of the papacy. Precisely because the 10 kingdoms were in the western half of the empire, precisely where you would expect them to be if the prophecy really was targeting the rise of the papacy. And that also answers the next complaint, as well, as far as being in the western half of the empire. So now there is only one left. Of the very best arguments the Counter-Reformation has to offer, to insulate this text from the papacy, and that is that these kingdoms are said to be in existence upon Christ's return, therefore they have to exist into modern day. And that is a very, very lame excuse. Because there is no explicit statement to that effect written anywhere in the Bible. that claim is taken from Daniel's symbolism only. That a rock comes and smashes the statue, and an everlasting divine rule, i.e., the kingdom of God, is established in its place. All symbolism, and nothing more. It could mean anything. We won't really know what that really means until we get there in time and see it. But there is nothing but an interpretive assumption behind that claim. It is the use of circular reasoning. And it is a completely invalid and rather disingenuous logic. But even here, the Counter-Reformationist is not off the hook because, as stated earlier, after 3 kingdoms are destroyed, there are 7 remaining, and if you look up how many kingdoms there are in Europe today, you will find exactly and precisely 7. What are the odds of that? So far from disproving the 10 kingdoms never happened, the fact that there are exactly 7 kingdoms today in modern Europe actually proved the 10 kingdoms really did happen, precisely as it was both prophesied, and as it was recorded in history. And as recorded in the best historical documentation in the history of the Western world. So out of the Counter-Reformation's 5 talking points, which represent the very best arguments they have, the first 2 are ridiculous standards they can't even live up to themselves, and which disprove their own claims. In the last 3, actually prove the prophecy in chapter 13 is targeting the rise of the absolute monarchy of the Roman papacy. Once again, of these 5 very best arguments that they have, 2 disprove the Counter-Reformation themselves. In the last 3 prove what they are trying to disprove is actually really true. Their very own complaints backfire on them and prove the 10 kingdoms really did happen. The truth is, Counter-Reformationists are completely out of excuses. They are defending the Antichrist. And what's worse, is the fact that they know it. So we will begin our examination of the first prophecy, beginning in verse 1, which reads as follows, quote, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw out of the sea a beast ascend, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Upon his horns 10 diadems, and the name blasphemy." End quote. In chapter 1 verse 9, John told us, quote, "I, John, who also am your brother, and companion in the tribulation, and in the kingdom and patience of Jesus Christ, was in the isle that is called Patmos, for the word of God, and for the testimony of Jesus Christ." End quote. In chapter 1 verse 9, John has already told us he is on the island of Patmos when he is having these visions. In chapter 13, verse 1, he tells us he is on a shoreline or beach on the island of Patmos, and he is looking out into the sea. You would think that he would be looking west, out into the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. But Patmos is an island, and it is surrounded by sea in every direction. And southwest is where the main body of the Mediterranean Sea would be. So it would be natural to think that is the direction he was looking. But John tells us he is facing east. How does he tell us he is facing east? Because he says he sees a 7-headed beast rise out of the sea. Remember in chapter 12, he made a reference to this same constellation, which is the constellation Hydra, and which was depicted with 7 heads. Constellations rise from the east, and they descend or set in the west, so John is telling us he is facing east. This is a picture of one of the main beaches on the eastern side of the island of Patmos. If John was looking east into the Mediterranean Sea from the island of Patmos, he would have been looking in the direction of the city of Ephesus. This location is an important geographical reference for what he is about to prophesy. John has already pointed to the city of Ephesus concerning this topic. In the letter of 1 John, in chapter 2, verse 18, written to disciples in the city of Ephesus, he prophesied to them that although there were already many antichrists, plural, the Antichrist, singular, was coming to their city. And in Revelation chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, also addressing the same Ephesians, he states that these same antichrists claim to be apostles, but are lying, and that they are the Nicolaitans. Here in the very first verse of this chapter, where he is going to address all the now famous markers of the Antichrist, such as the rise of the Antichrist to power, the image of the beast, and the mark of the beast, he begins his prophecy staring straight across the Mediterranean Sea, once again, at the city of Ephesus. Why is that important? Because Counter-Reformationists, who are spreading disinformation about the Antichrist, know fully well that is precisely what they are doing. The reason they know they are doing that is because they know about John's references to the city of Ephesus. And they choose to intentionally ignore those references, because that is all they can really do with them. As pointed out in previous videos in this series, for those who wish to hide what John was really prophesying, it makes it impossible to get away with that. Obviously, if John was describing Nero, the city of Ephesus would have been a pointless reference. Ephesus had little to nothing to do with Nero, any more than any other city in the Roman Empire. And if he were prophesying a future Antichrist, at the end of the world, there would be no city of Ephesus left even there, because it would be abandoned and become nothing more in the future than a site for archaeological ruins. In both cases, John's reference to the city of Ephesus extinguishes the pretense he was talking about anything else than what he was clearly describing, and the prophecy itself would begin by staring across the sea, directly at the city of Ephesus. Whenever the subject of the Antichrist is brought up, never forget John's repeated references to the city of Ephesus, and you will never be deceived again about what John meant. John was focused on the city of Ephesus when he gave this prophecy. And that focus eliminates both preterist and futurist interpretations of the book of Revelation completely. John's focus on the city of Ephesus leaves the historicist interpretation as the only viable interpretation left for the book of Revelation. The only one. Both the preterist interpretation and the futurist interpretation have to ignore John's focus on the city of Ephesus, which is clearly spelled out in 1 John chapter 2 verse 18, in Revelation chapter 2 verses 1 through 7, and here in chapter 13, verse 1. So we will put Hydra rising from the sea on the eastern horizon, in our astronomical column, and we will put Ephesus in our geographical column. In our historical column we will put 10 kingdoms. And in our symbolic column we will put the name blasphemy. In our mathematical column we will put 7 heads plus 10 horns plus 10 crowns for a total of 27. In verse 2, we read, quote, "And the beast I saw was similar to a leopard, his feet is that of a bear and his mouth is the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave to him his power and his throne and great authority." End quote. In verse 2, we see John shift from his reference to the 7-headed Hydra, to something he describes as like a leopard, the feet of a bear, and the mouth of a lion. All commentators on the book of Revelation notice that John is echoing a text from the book of Daniel, which also refer to these same 3 creatures of a leopard, a bear and a lion. As we noted earlier, this text is not the only text in Revelation in which John will echo texts from the book of Daniel. But here we see it once again. In Daniel chapter 7, verses 3 through 7, Daniel wrote, quote, "And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I beheld the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And behold another beast, a second, like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it between the teeth of it, and they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I beheld, and lo another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold the 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly. And it had great iron teeth, it devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it, and it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns." End quote. In chapter 2 of Daniel, interpreting a dream for Nebuchadnezzar, he also describes the 4 empires as a statue with the head of gold, the chest of silver, the waist and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and feet of clay mixed with iron. The 4 empires described by Daniel's prophecies have been easily recognized as Babylon, Persia, Greece and Rome, for literally thousands of years now. The feet of clay mixed with iron and the 10 toes was the same reference to what John is now prophesying, and thus why he repeats the symbolism from the book of Daniel, making the connection. But John applies imagery from all three of these beasts to this one beast, suggesting that it will contain elements of all three of these previous empires, Babylon, Persia and Greece, within it. It will arise quickly like the speed of the leopard, like Greece. It will have the ferocity of Persia the bear. And it will have the mouth of the lion Babylon. Since we know John is echoing these texts from Daniel, we also know he is repeating the same themes in his symbolism. Both texts describe beasts rising from the sea. Daniel describes a succession of monarchical empires. But John is describing the rise of a new monarchical empire. In both cases, these monarchical empires are called beasts. In both cases, individual monarchs are described in the prophecies, but the prophecies are about the empires, not just the individual monarchs ruling them. Counter-Reformationists like to try to claim the beast is just one person. But that is not how the term is used. It is used to describe empires. The individuals are simply the personification of those monarchies. But it is the monarchy that these biblical texts are describing as beasts. It is the monarchies that have the power of the animals described, not just the individual people. Another way that you know John is describing the monarchy, and not just a single person, is that right here in the text itself, John describes more than one person involved with the monarchy. He describes the first beast, then beginning in verse 11, he describes a second beast, so there is clearly more than one person involved. He names two, and he refers to them as the first and second in his narrative. That is called ordinal numeration, and refers to a succession, which is precisely what you have in a monarchy. You have a succession of rulers. The term dragon is a reference to the ruler of the Roman Empire, as we pointed out earlier in chapter 12. Every symbolic use of the term dragon in the scriptures referred to the imperial ruler. John specifies that he is discussing the city of Rome in these references in chapter 17, verse 18. So, John also states that the dragon, a reference to the Roman Caesar, gives this monarchy its power. And John makes a note on the text to remark that is not the normal range of power for a monarch. He describes it as great power, meaning unusual power. More than normal, monarchical power. Its power is extensive, even for a monarchy. And John is going to describe the extent of that power, in detail, in the following texts. John's reference to the dragon also gives us a geographical reference to the city of Rome. And this text is also giving us some astronomical information as well. If you look into the sky, in the vicinity of Hydra, you will notice three constellations: Lynx, Ursa Major, and Leo Minor. Ironically, these three constellations are precisely what John is describing. Lynx looks like a leopard. If you notice John's language, he says it is like a leopard. That describes the appearance of a lynx. Secondly, he references the feet of a bear, that is Ursa Major, then he mentions the mouth of a lion, and that is Leo Minor. All three constellations are present right next to Hydra, the seven-headed beast that rises out of the sea on the eastern horizon. So we will put Lynx, Ursa Major, and Leo Minor in our astronomical column. We will put the city of Rome in our geographical column as the giver of this power and great authority, which is the beginning of an absolute monarchy, which we will note in our historical column. In our symbolic column we will note John echoes Daniel 7, which also mentions a leopard, a bear and a lion. And we will put the number 1 in our mathematical column, because John is describing the traits of this absolute monarchy, which is symbolized by the number 1. When we come to verse 3, we see some major translation decisions that cloak the content of the verse. The retranslation of the Textus Receptus reads as follows, quote, "And I saw one of his heads as butchered to death, and the stroke of his death was adored and admired in all the land behind the beast." End quote. We see a major difference between the retranslation of the Textus Receptus and the KJV text. The KJV text describes a wound to the head that is healed, and then everyone wonders after the beast, which makes perfectly no sense at all. But when you look closer at the words in the Textus Receptus, the head is not wounded, it is slaughtered or butchered. Thus it is not a wound. Secondly, a butchering wouldn't be healed anyway. And the term, translated as healed, is actually the term, admired or adored. We also know from verse 8 that references the crucifixion of Christ, and uses precisely the very same language. John is describing the worship or adoration of a crucifixion. But it is not the crucifixion of Christ, it is the crucifixion of the beast. And John states in verse 3, that the land that is behind the beast, are the ones doing the adoring of the crucifixion, of it. Apparently, at this time, adoring crucifixions, is not something that Christians who were associated with the Apostle John were actually doing. But John actually prophesies the origin of the practice here in verse 3, and he prophesies its origins will begin in Rome, the land that is behind the beast. So, in our geographical column, we will put the city of Rome. In our historical column we will put adoration of the crucifixion. In our symbolical column, we will note the Roman replacement of Christ, and in our mathematical column, we will put the number 1, because the text cites the number 1, as the fourth word in the verse. In verse 4, we read, quote, "And they groveled to the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they groveled to the beast, saying, Who is like the beast? Who is able to fight against him?" End quote. Verse 4 is a very simple text, which basically states people will give up hope of resistance, and acquiesce to the authority of this new monarchy, noting that whoever resists, basically ends up destroyed. There is astronomical information connected to this text, although it is not explicitly present. The previous section of the sky John pointed to were the trio of constellations, Ursa Major, Lynx and Leo Minor. The section of sky adjacent to it centers around two constellations, Corona Borealis, which means northern crown, and another constellation named Boötes. Verse 4 is a statement of completion of authority, symbolized in the crown of Corona Borealis. Ironically, the constellation, Boötes, was depicted as a shepherd with a shepherd's staff. But in the book, Babylonian Star Lore, author Gavin White states on page 207, that Boötes had actually been known as Shupah, and was associated with Enlil, the chief god of the pantheon of gods, of ancient Babylon, itself. So its significance here with this text is very important, and logistically, in the sky, it comes immediately after the bear, the leopard and the lion, John just previously explicitly pointed out. So, in the astronomical column, we'll make a note of the constellations, Corona Borealis and Boötes, with verse 4. In the historical column, we will make a note of acquiescence and agreement. In the symbolic column we will note groveling to Caesar and the new monarchy. And in the mathematical column, this text is the completion of the rise of the Antichrist, which is called the beast, to power. In verse 18, we are told the number of the beast is 666. In verse 4 however we have both the beast and the dragon. So our mathematical value will be 6.66 for the beast, plus 6.66 for the dragon, giving us the integer mathematical value of 13. When we get to verse 5, we come to another place in John's prophecies, where John is prophesying amazingly specific details. These are specific historical details, the Counter-Reformation keep safely hidden from the public under their piles and piles of disinformation they intentionally spew onto these texts. And here is one of those gems they desperately keep buried. Verse 5 reads as follows, quote, "And given to him was a mouth, preaching big and blasphemous. And authority was given to him to continue 42 months. End quote. A lot of attention is paid to the 42 months. But you will notice, very little attention is ever paid to the part about the mouth. And it is the part about the mouth that the 42 months is prophesying. If you don't know what the mouth is, the 42 months is irrelevant, because it is the mouth that the 42 months is measuring in time. If you do not even know what the mouth is, how on earth are you going to accurately understand what the 42 months is about? And Counter-Reformationists keep the reference to the mouth completely hidden from the public, because it openly identifies who they are, in history. The Counter-Reformation wants the public to believe that, the mouth, that John is prophesying is something good. When the truth is, John is identifying the mouth, not as something good, but as a development of the Antichrist, hundreds of years before it occurs. So whatever John is referring to in making reference to the mouth in this prophecy, he is making it known, the mouth is part of the rise of this absolute monarchy, which culminates in the worship of the image of the beast, the mark of the beast, and 666. The mouth is not something good, but rather, it is the servant of the Antichrist. You will find out what the mouth really is when we get to the historical fulfillment of the first prophecy. The mouth is a specific person and or thing that John is prophesying, but there is also astronomical information with this text. If you query the two words, constellation and mouth, it will bring up the name of a constellation called Pisces Austrinus. It is the constellation depicted as a single fish in the sky. It is also graphically represented in this very familiar form on your screen. Amazingly, this constellation is an ancient constellation that goes all the way back to ancient Babylon. It was the constellation that marked the summer and winter solstices. Quote, Pisces Austrinus originated with the Babylonian constellation simply known as the fish, Molku. Professor of astronomy Bradley Schaefer has proposed that ancient observers must have been able to see as far south as Mu Piscis Austrini to define a pattern that looked like a fish. Along with the eagle Aquila, the crow Corvus and water snake Hydra, Piscis Austrinus was introduced to the ancient Greeks around 500 BCE. The constellations mark the summer and winter solstices respectively. End quote. The great fish, or Pisces Austrinus, is not a symbol of Christ as the Counter-Reformation likes to pretend to the public. It is a hidden symbol of the Antichrist. And its secret is exposed, right here in verse 5. As the mouth, also known as Pisces Austrinus. So in the astronomical column, we will make a note of the solstice fish, Pisces Austrinus. In the geographical column, we will note the city of Antioch, because that is where the Nicolaitans originate. In the historical column, we will note the solstice because that is what Pisces Austrinus signifies. In the symbolical column we will note the activity of preaching, because that is what the mouth is said to do. When we get to the mathematical column, we have 42 months given to us as the ending, but we do not have an explicitly stated beginning. If we take the value of 42, and use a time conversion calculation of 1.42, that will give us a beginning value of 60. So we will make a note of both values of 60 as our potential beginning, and the explicitly stated value of 1260 as the ending. And whatever John is referring to as the mouth will be made apparent within that explicitly stated timeline of 1260. And we will see what that actually is when we get to our historical fulfillment. When we come to verse 6, John describes the nature of the preaching that will occur. He writes in verse 6, quote, And he opened his mouth to blaspheme God, his name and his tabernacle, and those in the heavenly tabernacle. End quote. He names 3 areas of hostility that will exist in the preaching of the mouth. First, it will contain ideas or theology that John describes as blasphemous. In the Greek language, this word is blasphemia, and is literally where we get the English word blasphemy. In the Greek language it means to vilify. But in John chapter 10 verse 33, we see that claiming to be God was also understood under the Torah to be an act of blasphemy. But Christ defended himself against this accusation as being a false accusation in verses 34 through 37, where Christ clarifies that what he said was that he said he was the Son of God, not God. He did not claim to be God. And that was an important distinction his accusers did not care to notice, which he pointed out to them directly, in verse 36. When you look up the definition of the English word blasphemy, the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary defines it as, quote, 1. A. The act of insulting or showing contempt for God. 1. B. The act of claiming the attributes of deity, or, 2. Irreverence towards something considered sacred. Definition 1b is definitely implied in the rest of the language of chapter 13, but definition 1a is spelled out explicitly in this verse. And John lists the identity of God, the sacred name of God, and those in the heavenly tabernacle. So this definitely indicates blasphemy in the sense of vilification. This mouth will vilify God, the sacred name of God, and those in the heavenly tabernacle. In short, this mouth will be extremely anti-Semitic in his preaching and theology. So in the historical column, we will put anti-Semitic. In the symbolic column, we will put preaching. And in the mathematical column, we will put the number 3, as in the 3 areas, this mouth will blaspheme. Verse 7 reads as follows. Quote, "And it was given to him to fight against the holy and conquer them, and he was given authority over all descendants and languages and ethnicities." End quote. In verse 7, we see once again a very clear and specific statement concerning both the geopolitical success and legal authority of this absolute monarchy. John makes 2 statements in this prophecy. 1, that this absolute monarchy will fight against the Kodesh, or holy, and that it will conquer them. This statement indicates John is seeing violent confrontation taking place, and that the absolute monarchy will prevail. The holy John is referring to here are not Catholic saints. John is Jewish, and he is referring to Jews who believe in Christ. In history, this group was called the Desposni. And what John prophesies here literally came to pass, as you will see in the historical fulfillment. And because the authority of this absolute monarchy is given by the dragon, which is a reference to the Roman Empire, it makes its occurrence in history really honestly unmistakable. There are not 20 different candidates for this prophecy that you have to decode and figure out. There has only been one of these in history. The Roman Empire no longer exists. It came to an end in 476 AD. So whatever John was prophesying here had to have happened before the year 476 AD. And there is no mystery as to what this refers to, unless you just wish to be a dishonest person over it, which Counter-Reformationists do not mind doing. But when you are listening to the lies of a Counter-Reformationist, remember that is precisely what you are hearing. Because there is no ambiguity over this text. It is as clear as the noonday sun. You cannot miss it, unless you just close your eyes, so you will intentionally not see it. And we also see in verse 7, that the authority of this absolute monarchy is generational, as it is given authority over all descendants. Those who wish to claim chapter 13 is about 1 or 2 people, are completely and probably intentionally missing 60% of the text. This chapter is about the rise of a new monarchy which will have generational authority. Obviously, if what John is describing is about 1 or 2 people, then there is no way it could have authority over generations. But verse 7 clearly states it has authority over all generations to come, and that authority was given to it by the Roman Empire, which ended in 476 AD. Meaning if it is just one man who is the beast, he is very old by now, because he would have to have been born at least before the year 476 AD, making him at least 1,545 years old by now. In order to have authority over all descendants, you have to have the existence of a monarchy that was given that authority to be exercised. Meaning also that John is clearly prophesying a succession of rulers who will sit in that throne, who is given authority over all future generations of descendants. And when we get to the historical fulfillment, you will see how literally true John's prophecy actually was. In this text, we have astronomical information with a reference, once again, to the constellation Corona Borealis. So we will make a note of Corona Borealis in the astronomical column. We will put the Roman Empire in the geographical column. In the historical column, we will note the term violent persecution that John mentions in the beginning of the verse. And in the mathematical column, we will use a time conversion of 7, which is fulfillment or completion of authority, times 4, taken from the 4 groups mentioned in the verse. The holy, the descendants, the languages and the ethnicities, which gives us the mathematical value of 28. Verse 8 reads as follows. Quote, "And they reverenced him, all those residing in the land, whose name was not written in the book of life of the Lamb, slaughtered before the founding of this order." End quote. Verse 8 is a fairly short statement, but John does a couple of very important things in this verse. The first important thing John does here is create a distinction concerning salvation. He states all those who reverence this monarch will not be written in the Lamb's book of life. The opposite of the book of life is the book of death. Pharisees believed that at the beginning of every year the book of life was opened and the book of death, and God determined the destiny of people during Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. John makes reference to the book of life 7 times in the book of Revelation, once again echoing the number of candles on the temple menorah. But here in this verse, he makes it clear that reverence for this absolute monarchy created by Rome is incompatible with salvation by the real Christ. If you reverence this monarch, you are not reverencing Christ. And if you reverence Christ, you will not reverence this monarch. John removes the possibility of doing both in verse 8. The second thing John does here is mirror the same term used earlier of the crucifixion of the beast, but contrast the fact that the real Christ was crucified before this order ever existed. And allegiance to this order was to be at enmity with the Christ of the apostles. John in essence says, they will not be worshipping Christ at all, they will be worshipping themselves. And anyone that reverences that order will not be saved. They will be damned. Even though it will no doubt constitute a majority of the people of the world. That is a very hard truth for modern Christians to hear, because they simply do not believe it is true. But John wasn't the only one who issued that warning. The same warning was issued by Christ himself in Matthew chapter 7 verses 21 through 23. Quote, "Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name? And in thy name have cast out devils? And in thy name done many wonderful works? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you, depart from me, ye that work iniquity." End quote. The word, many, in that text, is actually the word for the majority, or the word, most. The majority of Christians. Most Christians. And despite the fact that text was written thousands of years ago, it has come to pass, precisely as Christ warned, those same thousands of years ago. Unfortunately, if you are going to bother to believe in Christ at all, the very least you should do, is believe what he himself personally warned you about. Otherwise, you are wasting your time with empty lip service, that God will not honor, and will do you no good at all, on Judgment Day. And John echoes that truth once again, in verse 8. But here in Revelation, John describes the specifics of what causes that majority of Christians to never know the real Christ. They embrace the worship of a substitute invented by Rome. And John warns that Roman substitute will lead to eternal damnation. For both those who preach it and those who believe it. In the astronomical column, we will note the book constellation, Libra. In the geographical column, we will note again, John is speaking about the Roman Empire. In the historical column, we will note the subject of conversion. In the symbolical column, we will note, John was talking about the book of life. And in the mathematical column, for the Lamb, the book of life, and the Lamb, we will put the number 3. In verse 9, John writes, quote, "If anyone has ears, let them hear." End quote. When we come to verse 9 we see a very short proverbial statement as a lead into verse 10. Verse 9 is simply an introductory preface to verse 10. They are grammatically part of the same section and should be read together as part of the same verse. So we will treat them together in this section although they are separate verses. In verse 9, John gives a heads up or alert to preface what he is about to write in verse 10. Verse 9 is a familiar proverb seen in the New Testament. The proverb is used 6 times by Christ in the Gospels. John uses the same expression exactly 7 times in the book of Revelation. Once again, echoing the number of candles on the temple menorah. The proverbial expression simply means, listen up. Pay attention. What I am about to say or write is important. There are, however, two pieces of information we get from this small text. The first piece of information is the word ear. In Latin, the word ear is the word spica. Spica is a very old star bearing this Latin name, and it is ironically found in the same section of the sky that chapter 13 started off referring to, at the opening of the chapter, with the leopard, the lion, and the bear, and then moving to Coma Borealis and Boötes. Just beneath the constellation of Boötes is the constellation of Virgo, and Spica is the brightest star in Virgo. So we will make a note of Spica in our astronomical column. In our mathematical column, we will note the number 2 for ears. And that brings us to verse 10 and the end of the first prophecy. In verse 10, John issues two very important warnings. Thus why he prefaced his warnings with the reference to the proverb about if you have an ear, you had better listen. John writes, quote, "If any captivity assemble, into captivity they will lead themselves. If any with the sword kill, with the sword he need be killed. In this is the endurance and the faith of the holy." End quote. John issues two prohibitions or warnings. These two warnings address the two mistakes people will make in reference to the truths he is writing about. The first mistake will be to give in and just go along. He warns that the beast will have an assembly. But if you become part of this assembly, you will be leading your own self into slavery. And, as he warned previously, in verse 8, your name will not be written in the Lamb's book of life. But the other mistake people will make will be to take up the sword against this monarchy. And John prophesies that whoever takes up the sword will be killed by the sword. So neither compromise nor violence will be a successful strategy. You will have to succumb to neither temptation. Neither violence or compromise is the right path. And he ends the warning with pointing out the right path is simply endurance and faith. You need neither to compromise by joining the assembly, nor taking up the sword against it. Simply keep the faith in your home, as the Holy, or Kodesh, have done. This prophecy began with the leopard, the bear and the lion, lynx, Ursa Major and Leo Minor, and it will end in the same place. Assembly, the key word in verse 10, is also the name of a main constellation called Talitha, which means assembly. It is located in the foot of Ursa Major. In the historical column, we are told by John in verse 10 that there are going to be recriminations against resistance, so we will put the word extermination. And in the mathematical column, we have a time conversion of fullness times fullness, meaning 7 times 7, which is 49. So we will put 49 in our mathematical column ending the first prophecy, in chapter 13. This will complete the textual analysis of the first prophecy, from verse 1 to verse 10, in Revelation chapter 13. Next we will build out historical timeline, and see what events John was prophesying, from the island of Patmos in 95 AD. Now that we have finished our textual analysis, we will be able to construct the historical timeline for the events John was prophesying, using astronomical dating. John gives us the starting point for our timeline by echoing the texts from the book of Daniel. If you recall from earlier, Daniel 7 also mentioned the lion, the leopard and the bear, but it coincided with his interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, of the statue with the head of gold, the chest of silver, the thighs of brass and the 2 legs of iron. The 2 legs of iron were understood to be the Roman Empire. So John is letting his Jewish readers know he is prophesying something about those 2 legs of iron, and its transition into the 2 feet of iron mixed with clay, with the 10 toes. Which he also repeats referring to 10 kingdoms. In the year 285 AD, an historic reorganization of the Roman Empire occurred. While the empire had always had 2 administrative divisions of East and West since the time of the early Caesars, in the year 285 AD, Emperor Diocletian separated the 2 halves legally, and created emperors for both halves. And that is when our timeline for John's first prophecy, in chapter 13, begins. In verse 1, we have 27 plus 285, and that gives us the year 312. In verse 2, we have 1 plus 312, and that gives us the year 313. In verse 3, we have 1 plus the year 313, and that gives us the year 314. In verse 4, we have 13 plus the year 314, and that gives us the year 327. In verse 5, we have 60 plus the year 327, and that gives us the year 387. In verse 6, we have 3 plus the year 387, which gives us the year 390. In verse 7, we have 28 plus the year 390, which gives us the year 415. In verse 8, we have 3 plus the year 415, which gives us the year 418. In verse 9, we have 2 plus the year 418, and that gives us the year 420. In verse 10, we have 49 plus the year 420, and that gives us the year 469. And that completes our construction of the historical timeline. And this is what our historical timeline looks like. If our timeline is correct, we will see the astronomical dating confirm both the events that occur on this timeline, and the synchronicity of the timeline itself with the astronomical clock in the heavens, which we will examine in the section on the historical fulfillment, which is next. In this video, you saw that the Counter-Reformation's most formidable group is synonymous in the dictionary with the word equivocation, which means to literally hide the truth. And you saw that their claims about the 10 kingdom theory are flimsy excuses for not wanting to admit they are serving the cause of the Antichrist on earth. You also saw that we constructed an historical timeline for the first prophecy in chapter 13, from verse 1 to verse 10, and we are now ready to cover its actual and literal fulfillment in real history, which we will now do in the very next video. Do not miss the exciting conclusion of John's first prophecy in chapter 13, in history. Thank you for watching.